Thank you for everyone for joining us this morning or this afternoon for those who are joining us from Europe. As you know, we organize these briefings on a regular basis to set the scene before important political, geopolitical, strategic events. And of course, this one takes place a couple of days before the NATO summit in Ankara. GMF is super busy in the preparation phase of this summit, shaping the conversation and trying to put on your radar, be it governments, corporates, or media representatives, what you need to have on your map as you look at the key outcomes from this Ankara summit. And the magic of GMF, as Eva was saying, is that I'm based in Washington, D.C. Ian Lesser is based in Brussels, Claudia in Berlin, and my colleague Dan here in Washington as well. And so the purpose of these briefings is really to give you a truly transatlantic understanding of what's going on and what is at stake. So with that, I just wanted to start very quickly with three things I believe you should have on your radar. First, I would say the agenda. We all know now the three priorities for this summit. Number one, increased investment in defense. Number two, increase industrial production. And number three, continued support for Ukraine. And my take on that is that this is exactly the right priority. The three priorities are exactly what we should be focusing on in that particular summit in Ankara. And it is also an indication that the topics are being addressed in a much more practical and operational way than maybe in previous summits. And these priorities have truly been co-authored on both sides of the Atlantic. So on that first point, as you know, the Trump administration is viewing the summit as a so-called report card on how allies are progressing towards last year's 5% spending commitment at the Hague summit. Despite the fact that nearly all allies have reached the 2% goal in 2024, with some big spenders nearing the 5%, I think you need to expect the US reactions to be mixed, with President Trump praising top spenders and calling out low spenders. And I would spotlight what happened in Bergen in Norway a couple of weeks ago. You might have noticed that the group that met was a small group, and the group purposely integrated the countries that are viewed by the American administration as performing in terms of reaching these spending commitments, and with the other countries being relegated into a secondary place. And you'll see more of that at the Ankara NATO summit. This summit is also, for me, the official kickoff of the Pentagon's announced 6-month force posture review that was announced a couple of weeks ago. And so this is also a way for Europeans, Canadians, allies, and the United States to get together and start co-offering what comes next, what these 6 months reviews mean, both for the United States and Europe. And so that's the first basket for me. The second important aspect of this Ankara summit is the defense tech innovation, which will be, for me, the most interesting to watch. I think you've all seen how many industries will be present, and that's a record compared to previous summit, and that is done purposely because the idea is really to show how allies are translating the number one basket, which is spending more, into industrial capabilities. And yes, Europe has increased, its spending, but procurement, innovation, coordination are not keeping pace. And for me, there is a central paradox that is just stark. Europe is beginning to spend for wartime while still procuring and planning for peacetime. And so closing that gap for me is going to be the defining defense policy challenge for Europe of this decade. And that's really, a conversation that will be strengthened and reinforced at that Ankara summit. NATO Secretary General Marco Rutte has previewed major industrial announcement at the summit. Turkey will also play an important role in that conversation as the host country. So, what to watch, I would say, for Europe is really to build this 21st century procurement architecture, and also policymakers and industry CEOs meeting and coming together as strategic partners, and not just having defense industries as contractors, but as participants and contributors to the broader strategic conversation. So you're going to see a greater integration of the political and the industrial ecosystems, and that's also the message that NATO wants to send in Ankara. The third and last things I think you need to have on your radar, obviously, is Ukraine. And there are some announcements that are about to be made about additional, packages to support Ukraine. But I think what's really interesting to watch, and you will probably see this live during the Ankara summit, is how the center of gravity of support for Ukraine is shifting towards Europe. Today, the EU is now the leading contributor with more than $226 billion that have been mobilized since 2022, including 86 billion in military aid. And so the message that you're going to see also at the Ankara summit is how European allies are going to lean even more into supporting Ukraine at a moment, as you all know, where the momentum is really in favor of Ukraine. A last piece of Ukraine, which links to the second basket on the industrial component, what I think is absolutely fascinating to watch is the extent to which now an increasing number of European defense industries, but also European tech startups, are now partnering with Ukrainian defense industries and tech innovation hubs, and even starting to co-build production sites in Ukraine. And so I will, finish with this following thought, which is I think a lot of the immediate responses to Europe's capability to offset some of the withdrawal or reduction of US critical capabilities actually lie in Ukraine. And in partnering with Ukraine's defense industry and innovation hubs, and that's what you're seeing live. And that dynamic, for me, beyond the package, the aid package to Ukraine, is really interesting to watch as it is happening now at that particular moment. So I'll leave you with these couple of thoughts, and very happy to leave the floor to my colleague Ian, who sits in our Brussels office.
Alexandra, thank you very much indeed. I mean, let me maybe just very briefly try to build on what you've already said, and to offer you a couple of other thoughts, maybe slightly less formal in the sense of not being on the known agenda yet, but clearly as context and in the background. Because there is a known agenda with those three elements that you talked to very, very clearly. And those aren't necessarily straightforward things, but beyond that, there are also some other things that I think would be worth looking out for, especially because these summits are not as scripted affairs as they used to be years ago. It doesn't mean to say they won't be positive. We had that experience with the G7 recently, but we'll have to see. The first thing I'd mention is that there is in the context of this looming force posture review, I think there will surely be efforts on the part of European allies to kind of sway the discussion around this in ways that would be favorable for Europe. Will it change the outcome in the end? Hard to say exactly. There's also a dimension on Capitol Hill for this as well. But these kinds of reviews are not new. They're done. They've been done regularly over the past decades. So there's some track record there. And there is I think, some scope for Europe to have a say in what this looks like when it comes out. The second point I make is about Iran, which of course is not on the agenda per se, but it's in the room, if I can say. And that has a couple of pieces to it, I think, quite beyond the policy and the war itself. There's a question of, what asks the administration might have of European allies to secure shipping through the Strait of Hormuz and in the adjacent region after a cessation of the hostilities. In a more benign environment, I think there is a feeling in Washington that Europe could take up a lot of that mission. I think there's a feeling in Europe that although that would be in Europe's interest to participate in, they don't want to be left alone. And so I think there is some business to be done, at least on the margins, with regard to post-conflict maritime security over Iran. Missile defense, air defense more generally, the alliance is meeting in a location that is well within range of Iranian ballistic missiles, actually. Now, I'm not predicting that anything bad will happen. I don't think it will at all. But it does concentrate minds to think that Turkey itself was targeted twice or perhaps 3 times during the course of the conflict. Integrated air defense and what the allies can bring to the table on that front, I think, will be very, very important. And then finally, maybe just a word about the Turkish piece of this, because clearly there is, at least reportedly, a very good relationship between President Trump and President Erdogan. That has many aspects. I think one consequence of that may be that President Trump will come to Ankara with the idea that he ought to help President Erdogan deliver a success for the summit. And so even though there's always a degree of unpredictability in these things, and it's increased in recent years, I think there will be a desire for this to be a success for the host. And I think that will have an effect on the atmosphere. And it may also be, just to mention this, that President Trump will come to Ankara with something of a strategic gift for Turkey, whether it's about coming back into the F-35 program. It's not so easy to do, but it's possible. Or some resolution of the S-400 issue, the two go together, but also some other kinds of deals that you could imagine, because Turkey is very much in the thick of this whole defense innovation process that's going on today. So those are just a couple of thoughts from my side, but happy to follow up on any of these things. Thanks very much indeed, and it's my pleasure to turn it over to my colleague, Claudia.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Alexandra, for paving the way so perfectly that I don't have much to say. I will try to add 3 thoughts, and then my last thought is what I'm going to watch and what you might want to watch. So the first is just a reminder, as Ian did, on the bigger picture, and that's the shifted focus. If you remember the Hague Summit last year, allies were hoping that they can appease Trump, thereby keep him in NATO and stop the US from shrinking their contributions to European defense. That was last year. This year, it's very clear that the US role is changing anyway, and the main hope is to do damage control and to get predictability. So this year, it's clearly understood by European allies that the mechanisms have changed. It's not about Trump, it's a structural long-term change. So the recalibration or the renegotiation is anyway underway. And from next year, 2027, the US will provide 50% to NATO, but not more. Hence, burden shifting is taking place. It can be shaped, but not avoided. Greenland made that very clear. So the question is not if, but how and when. So Europeans hope to get even more than damage control. They hope to get predictability. But predictability requires strategy and processes, or if you prefer, plans and bureaucracy. And both are currently maybe a bit short supply in the US. So Europeans might be disappointed, and they might have to concentrate on damage control. Second, to reinforce the point that Alexandra made, the magic of the defense industry. The defense industry is supposed to be the badly needed unifying topic of that summit. Allies want to present industry as a mean to make an economic case for NATO, so that Trump can say, oh, actually, NATO is worth it because my companies have a huge European market, and we can do co-production, given that the US production capabilities are really, really difficult, or they don't have it in the moment, and particularly after the Iran war, you can no longer hide it. So positioning Europe as a market for US companies is one element, and indeed the sales to the US have been going up. And the second is co-production. For example, like German MBDA is doing it for the Patriots, but there are many others that you hear rumors in the moment about that might be signed in Ankara. So many MOUs and deals will be signed. And there are rumors, again, I can't confirm them, that Tomahawks and others might be co-produced in Europe. Third element, a deterrence summit. NATO summit usually have one key function, and that's to show unity, cohesion, solidarity to the outside world, potential enemies, and inside to the allies. So it's to say, if one is attacked, all the others will be there. That's the main task of a NATO summit. And that will be a difficult one, as you all know. But you could still see elements to send that deterrence message. We expect new pledges from European allies, overshadowed by the postal review, obviously. We have the assessment of the 3.5 defense spending. So you have a financial deterrence element. You have the industrial deterrence element, because the industrial base is part of the deterrence picture. And some weeks ago, we had a public NPG statement, Nuclear Planning Group statement, which is very unusual, which we haven't seen over the last years, which underlines the nuclear deterrence message. So you could try to frame it as a deterrence summit with the financial bit, the industrial bit, the nuclear bit, and the conventional bit. Having said that, what I'm going to watch and what I will be trying to find when observing the summit. The third, as Ian already said, wildcard Iran. I'll leave it to what Ian said, everything was there. The second is a language on Russia. In the NATO strategic concept adopted after the renewed Russian invasion in 2022, Russia was described as the biggest threat to prosperity, peace, and stability. Last year in The Hague, it only said the long-term threat posed by Russia to Euro-Atlantic security. So I wonder where the language on Russia will be that year, because if you spend so much on defense, if you have so much industry, there must be a reason why you're doing that. So it would be great if it would be mentioned in clear terms. What I will also be watching is not only how Trump treats the Europeans, whether he's elbowing out one head of state of the family picture, but also how Europeans treat Trump. Because if you have observed over the last weeks, you could see that even the rather populist governments like Meloni, the love affair seems to be over. So it could be interesting to watch how the Europeans deal with Trump and how Trump deals with the European, and whether the tone compared to last year has changed. And the last thing, or two things I'm going to watch, is a small print in the defense industrial MOUs or plans, if they are public, which we obviously don't know. So the assumption currently in the US is that the pie is big enough for everybody. But if the pie is that big, Europeans also want to have their share. And not only co-production, but IPs and design authority. So it could be interesting to see who is actually doing what on the defense industrial base. Last point, what I'm going to watch is what is going to drive the poster review. Not sure we will get much insights, but it would be interesting to see whether it is going to be a broad system of good and bad allies, or whether it is based on a threat assessment. So is it driven by politics or defense needs? And if you just look at that list, it can actually be a very exciting summit. And on that note, I hand over to my colleague Dan from DC. Thank you.
Thank you. It's always fun to close out after such a strong lineup. Let me start on the kind of defense industrial point. And I think the view from Washington will very much be the question of how do you take more resources on the European side and turn it into greater capability, because it's not guaranteed. Is this kind of an industrial policy exercise, or is it very much focused on lethality? I think that's one of the questions that US policymakers will have coming to Ankara. And then also, kind of, is the alliance learning lessons not only from the battlefield in Ukraine, but also the Middle East, where we've seen these kind of low-cost, high-volume capabilities on both sides being used to quite sort of significant impact on the battlefield. In terms of industry, I think this will be a really interesting summit where you'll have a mix of kind of traditional industry and new entrants. And defense tech is booming on both sides of the Atlantic, where you have startups, investors, commercial companies. It's a space I think you'll see more highlighted in this summit, also a space, frankly, under pressure as nations within NATO reassert sovereignty and have differences over military uses of AI. It's something that at GMF we're focused on, having launched a new defense tech task force just a few weeks ago. And so that, I would say, the role of industry is going to be key. One area that I think will be unsaid but important in terms of context is China. In 2022, the NATO strategic concept framed China as a systemic challenge. I personally would expect to hear very little about China publicly during this summit. Yet, if you kind of strip away some of the rhetoric around NATO defense spending targets, U.S. pressure on European allies and Canada to spend more and convert that into capability is very much motivated and driven by China in the Indo-Pacific, the need to shift more resources, more focus there, and have allies step up in Europe. So I think this will be sort of, again, what is unsaid, but very much present. And it also, frankly, gives impetus to the kind of pressure for burden shifting today that it will continue beyond the current administration, just given the reality of military trend lines in the Indo-Pacific. And then finally, also in the Indo-Pacific, again, just personally, what will be interesting to watch is the role of the Indo-Pacific Four, which is Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. Historically, they've been often invited to NATO summits. They were not last year. This year, I believe they have been. It'll be interesting to see is their role, sort of what, if anything, their role is. And the reality is there are opportunities for cooperation, particularly on defense tech in terms of cross-cutting military challenges. So I'll close there.
So I wanted to ask about this question of industrial production, which is, on the one hand, you, as Claudia says, they want to show that Europe is a market for the US and therefore buy lots of American weapons. On the other hand, there's a desire to get away from dependency on American technology, be ITAR free, be able to act. So how do countries balance those two things? And what are the tensions within that?
Anton, I didn't hear the second question, but lovely to see you. Can you just repeat the second question?
How countries balance the question, how Europeans balance the question of dependence on America versus wanting to show it's a good market for American weapons, and also whether that creates tensions with Donald Trump and the administration going forward.
I think there's no European answer, but you have as many European answers as you have allies, or maybe a bit less, but you don't have a unified European answer. I think you have a crystallization point in that summit, and that Europeans really would like to make sure that this summit takes place without major problems, precisely because it is sending already a political deterrence message. And if the political message is weakened, the military is losing importance too. So they agree on that summit, but beyond that summit, you don't have much agreement. You know, the traditional dividing lines, for example, with France insisting very much on focusing on the EDTIB, so the European Defense Technological Industrial Base, saying that if we want to be more sovereign, we need to invest in our own industry, and we need to increase sovereignty. Many European countries, particularly France, remembers that over the Iraq War in 2003, the US stopped defense industrial cooperation out of political disputes. So there is some prehistory. So Europeans try to, so that's one European school. The other European school is to say we have this famous deadline 2029, so the year where Russia might be able to attack a NATO territory. So the focus should be on speed. And speed, to a large extent, might mean off the shelf, might mean American. And that hits the problem of American production capabilities. So in the moment, many Europeans realize that what they have ordered might not arrive in time and might be more expensive. So they are tempted to turn European, or they are tempted to turn extra European, like South Korea. So I think we cannot talk about a whole European response. It's more that countries decide upon their needs and they decide upon their political vision about the future of transatlantic relationship and the future of Europe. And I think that's for me one of the biggest dividing lines that will come up very strongly after the summit again. Just to give you the example that I mentioned earlier, MBDA producing Patriots in Germany. Some celebrate it as a great success, and others say this is just increasing the dependency from the US without having much political commitment. So the idea that the defense industry could be, I know it's not a good word, but I don't find a better one, could help to hibernate a difficult time and build a bridge on which Europeans and Americans can meet and continue cooperation, It works for some Europeans, and some other Europeans wholeheartedly reject it. So I don't see a European unified position. I see many European positions, but they try to preserve the unity at that summit, at least.
Great. Alexandra
Yeah,
and
my
Dan,
colleagues
did
want
you
to jump.
want to come in
Yeah,
before
no.
we go to the next
Yeah,
section?
just wanted to add on what Claudia just shared. First, I think there is it all needs to start by which capabilities are truly required right now, and where are the capabilities gaps. So how do you map these critical capabilities that Europeans need to build up and anticipate what it will mean for the United States to reduce some of these capabilities, right? So I think that's number one. The second one is then how to what Claudia said, how do you coordinate within the EU framework or within coalitions of the willing, the build up of these specific capabilities? And there is, yes, a speed issue. And I think there is not a incompatibility in terms of doing three things at the same time when it comes to Europeans. One, they will obviously have to do more as Europeans, right? Because that's just not, there's no other, possibility. Number two, of course, they will have to continue to partner with U.S. defense industries. And I would say, especially in the short immediate term. And then third, as Claudia was mentioning, Europeans will have to do more with other powers outside of the Euro-Atlantic space. South Korea has become the second military provider to Europe over the past 4 years after the United States. You also have India. You also have Japan partnering with the UK, with Italy. So I think we need to look at the buildup of the European defense industrial base in a more hybrid way and not in an exclusive way. And I'll finish really with what I think is the most important and tricky thing to handle for Europeans right now is the timelines, right? It's the tempo. In the short term, the reliance on US defense industry is just a reality. But Europeans also need to build the future of European defense industry. And so there is a need to articulate the short term with the longer term. And I see absolutely no contradiction or no issue at all simultaneously articulating the three approaches that I just shared with you right now. And I think Dan has additional things to share.
I'll be very brief given the number of hands up. I would just say I think it's beyond foreign military sales when you think of defense industrial cooperation between the US and Europe. And I would just add, there's capital, so often US capital going into the kind of European defense tech ecosystem, joint adoption pathways, even forward production. So I think there's a way to look at this that is not as much a zero sum, is at least somewhat positive sum.
Thank you all for your input. Jörg Lau, international correspondent with Die Zeit. Alexandra, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on the paradox you mentioned, spending for wartime while procuring for peacetime. Can you be a little bit more specific about what that entails?
Yes, absolutely. There is I think, a desynchronization right now, and it's been a long time. But you see that even more now that Europeans are spending more, but it doesn't translate into a industrial capability of actually producing quickly and strategically. So there is really a procurement architecture that doesn't meet the moment of today and tomorrow for European defense industry. It's too slow, it's too bureaucratic, and you usually have these very long timelines, right? I mean, you've seen it with the SCAF, which now is dead, right? The German-French industrial project of building that future air combat fighter jet. but the timeline was being delayed and delayed and delayed. You may know about this European long-range missile initiative, the ELSA initiative, which is a good initiative bringing a couple of European countries together to build a future European-made long-range missile. But the deadline, again, it's 2030, the earliest, and it will be again pushed back again and again. And so the big issue I think that Europeans should be focusing on is the industrial cadence and capacity to actually deliver in a much quicker way to meet the moment. The second thing that Dan mentioned, and I think is underestimated, is that I think our industries also need to learn the lessons from the wars in Ukraine and Iran. These were not conventional wars. These were high-tech wars. And so how does these lessons also be integrated into Europe's procurement industrial policies? Because the armaments and the future of warfare is being highly, highly transformed by the use of AI and all of these cyber technology tools. So I think it's a dual thing that Europeans need to work on. It's the speed, their procurement policies that are way too slow, way too bureaucratic, and difficult to handle, and not allowing Europe to meet this moment. And then the second one is, are the armaments that Europe is currently investing in, are they the right type of weapons and equipment to meet the changing nature of warfare when you take both the immediate lessons learned of both the war in Ukraine and Iran? So that would be my answer to your question.
Emily from Reuters in Brussels. Just to follow up on those themes, I was wondering from your perspective, what do you think Europeans could concretely offer the US in the short term to keep the US engaged and committed in Europe? Thank you.
If I may, on this one, obviously this is a hot debate in Brussels, which we know. Look, I mean, I think from the point of view of the current administration, above all, it's money. I mean, it's spending, it's commitment on defense spending. But I think there is an interesting point to be made here about how the Secretary General is talking about this, and the way I think probably we should measure it, which is to say collectively, NATO, with the progress that NATO has made. When the Secretary General visited President Trump a few days ago, he was very articulate about this, but that the focus was very much on the collective progress that NATO has made and plans to make. Whereas, the battle here is that the administration comes looking, yes, at that, but also has in the back of its mind, or maybe even the front, the bilateral piece, the nation by nation piece. And there, of course, it's a very mixed picture. And here too, I think the point about Iran comes into play. We could argue perhaps it shouldn't, that these are separate things, but I do think inevitably there is a bit of political judgment here. And, the administration is perhaps looking for help, rhetorical or operational, from European allies on other fronts, on things like Iran, maybe in other areas as well. So I think there's a range of things here that go beyond just the amount of money that's being spent. It's also how you measure it, and the timelines. I think they would be impressed by something that looks more compressed. But this is just to add on the point that was made about the defense industrial side of this. I think Europe as a whole is much more comfortable with talking about this as industrial policy than as defense policy per se, which goes directly to Alexandra's point about what is being bought, for what purpose, and how far ahead are we looking in that planning.
Maybe I can add a little bit. Maybe to put it in a different way. Last year, Europeans hoped they could buy goodwill by spending more money. That was the hate pledge with 3.5% on defense and 1.5% on logistics. This year, they hope they can buy goodwill and security guarantees by new defense industrial contracts. But Europeans learned from last year that the love or security they bought with 3.5% didn't last very long. And particularly the Greenland crisis showed the Europeans that maybe their way of trying it was not so successful. So last year money, this year industry. In the end, what Europeans are looking for is predictability. But as I earlier said, predictability means you have a plan and a strategy, and you have the bureaucratic structures that allow you to implement the plan and the strategy. And my fear is that Europeans still focus on the hope to be able to influence US policy, rather than focusing their mind on how they see the burden shifting process. So as Alexandra initially said, the idea should be, what is our plan? How do we want to do that? Europeans have to think about how they approach the next political guidance, how they approach the next NATO defense policy planning process. And if they think they take over a greater part of the burden, this famous burden shifting, they should have a plan rather than trying to do something on which they famously failed over the last year. They were not able to influence US policy, neither on Ukraine and Russia, nor on Greenland, nor on Iran, nor on moving troops from Europe. So I think our mindset shift is to say, what do Europeans focusing on? Trying to please or getting their own act together and to make offers? And I think that's probably one of the big, really, really difficult balances to strike at this summit. Obviously, Europeans are stronger with the US, but in the same time, they don't have much impact. So the big task for the Europeans is to redefine what used to be the transatlantic relationship towards a more clearly defined, rational, interest-driven, pragmatic transatlantic bargain. And I think that's the overarching intellectual task. So not to try to keep something which we cannot keep, but to redefine it and try to wonder what Europe needs in order to then redefine the transatlantic relationship from a relationship to a bargain that is interesting for both sides. So that goes a little bit beyond your question. But you ask, what do they try? Last year money, this year industry. Next year we have the summit in Albania. Curious to see what that's going to be.
And maybe a two-finger on that. That's exactly what Claudia and a core group here at GMF have been co-leading since the kickoff of our European Defense Roadmap initiative. That's exactly what we're trying to shape and use our pan-European network of offices as a way also of having Europeans work on what comes next and then be able to deliver this as a credible, doable roadmap in Washington early 2027.
Thanks so much. Appreciate this. I just wonder if I could ask for a follow-up on Greenland. Both like, to what extent do you think European NATO governments view this as a settled crisis or a kind of live ongoing issue? And, with 6 months hindsight since the climb down at Davos, I wonder what you see as the kind of fallout from that, or what in policy terms has really changed as a result of the US threats around that time?
I can take it if you want. From my understanding of, and for many, how I see it from the outside and from what I hear from many European governments, it's not at all settled. The bilateral negotiations are ongoing, and they are ongoing in a way that Denmark is deeply worried. So I expect this to come up again as the negotiations seem to follow the goal that was outlined in the crisis. So it's affecting Danish, Greenlandic sovereignty. So it's not over. That's the first point. The second, there's a huge difference in perception of the Greenland crisis between Europe and the US. Many of my US friends and colleagues, officials, tell me, listen, the president said it's over, so it's over. Why are you still so annoyed about it? And from a European point of view, the Greenland crisis was a turning point. I think until Greenland, many Europeans hoped that with more spending and trying to behave in a good manner, transatlantic relations can be somehow kept the way they used to be in the past. And for many Europeans, Greenland was the step too far. Many European governments perceived that Greenland was an attack by one ally on the sovereignty and territorial integrity of another ally. And that was a deep shock. And after Greenland came Iran, and that made Greenland not like an exception, but like a new, maybe not normal, but at least not an exception. So from a European point of view, governments started drawing a line. Russia-Ukraine negotiations, the US is changing its position, not longer a supporter of Ukraine, rather a moderator, if not supporting the Russian position. Second data point, Greenland, where the US is not behaving like an ally in a life insurance, but rather like a challenger. Third data point, Iran. You can carry on and you can talk about the troop reductions. Poland, yes, maybe no, maybe yes. My Polish friends still don't know where they are on the Polish troop presence. But clearly that troop decisions are not driven by security and defense considerations, but by a political reward strategy. So if you take all that together, Europeans draw a line where they see this relationship has structurally changed. It's not only about Trump, it's about the US and the administration as such. So Greenland, for me, to answer your question, is not over. I expect it to come back, and it has been a turning point for the Europeans.
Thank you. Thanks, and hi to everyone. Just a quick question. The Americans are warning about spending, right? Supposedly, NATO had agreed to 3.5 plus 1.5% by 2035. As far as I can tell, it's only 2026. And yet the Americans are already threatening to play good girls and bad girls. And I'm wondering, is this serious? Is this just another way for the salesman in chief, Mr. Rutte, to suck up to Donald Trump? I mean, how do you interpret this, effort, as Whitaker says, to have a credible path to 5% when we know Britain, France, other countries have no credible path? They don't have a credible path to 3.5%, let alone 5%. So I'm just curious how seriously to take these American warnings in your views. I mean, who knows? But thank you for engaging, put it that way.
Steve, if I may, I'm sure all my colleagues will have a view about this. I might, short answer is to take them very seriously indeed, because I do think it reflects in some ways the outlook of President Trump and the administration, which is to focus above all on the bilateral piece of this. I mean, it would be very nice, as I was saying earlier, if the collective progress was the metric. It's one metric, it's not the only one. And even by that metric, 2035, well, we could debate this. So, if everything else was fine, and the atmosphere on a whole set of other fronts, from Greenland to trade to whatever it might be, was positive, there, I think, would be an inclination to give allies the benefit of the doubt on this. But at the moment, that's not the crisis of trust. In a way, I think, at least in the administration's perception, is a two-way street. In fact, and things simply don't stay in their lane in the way that they used to. We didn't mention trade, but this surely too will be in the back of many minds when they arrive in Ankara. So I would take it seriously.
Okay.
It may be a very brief answer because I need to drop off. But one thing I think that's really important for Europeans to keep in mind is that either these 6 months of strategic review that was announced by the Pentagon, either this is going to be a window of opportunity or a window of vulnerability. And ideally, this will need to be co-authored by both sides of the Atlantic. But also in reality, the result of these 6 months of review announced by the Pentagon, the response to that really lies in Europe and what Europeans will be able to deliver. Number two, how do you do this? I think there's a need to also resynchronize the US calendar and the European calendar. We all know that the EU Rearm Europe initiative that was launched a couple of years ago, the deadline is 2030, and already 2030 to have a more autonomous operational Europe is already perceived as extremely ambitious. The timeline of the United States is 2027. And so how do you reconcile these timelines to make it credible and doable, both for Europeans and Americans? That, for me, is the thing we need to work on. And this is where GMF is really plugged into these conversations. The last thing is that I think what would be really healthy for Europeans is to think more in terms of what's in the interest of Europe, first and foremost, instead of always looking at what Washington is asking them to do. And that will fundamentally change the way they think of their defense expenses and the way they translate this into industrial outputs. Very last concluding thought. Also, I think there's a real need for political leaders across Europe to explain why, to their public opinion, why it's important today to invest in defense. I don't see that in any European capitals right now, and why investing in defense is actually also investing in tech innovation and investing in energy transition. It's not something that, defense investment is not something countries do in silo. It is actually having ramifications in these two others important areas, which is tech innovation and energy. And what Ukraine has shown over these past couple of years of war, and that is that this is a triangle. It's defense, it's tech, and it's energy all at once. And what I would love to see is European leaders communicating, conveying that message in a much more strategic, forceful, and forward-looking way, so that citizens understand it's not just about, defense expenses. It's actually something that will feed into the future of Europe's, societal resilience. So I think that's lacking right now in the European conversation. And maybe, countries that do that, I think, superbly well are the Nordic countries. Sweden, Norway, Finland. Of course, they face a eastern flank that is highly, disruptive and destabilized. But the way they have conveyed that in a holistic way to their citizens, I think, is a model of what many other European countries should be doing right now. But thank you again so much, and to be continued, obviously.
Thanks for doing this, and I hope you can hear me well. It's kind of a follow-on to Steve's question, and I'm wondering if you'll want to talk yourselves out of a job. We know the Trump administration doesn't like multilateralism by design, right? You've spoken all about political reward strategy, the Bergen Group. The US ambassador was speaking yesterday about rewards for countries that do more on spending, like high-level meetings, military exercises. And he was asked whether, do you have anything in store for those who don't make it? And he said, yes, but I'm not going to tell you what it is. So there's kind of an implicit threat there. And with this review, I mean, as Europe takes on a bigger role, surely the US would just step back more, right? Isn't this in the end just kind of a quiet quitting of NATO?
We all have thoughts on this one. Well, I mean, I'm happy to start. I mean, I think that a more European NATO is coming. It'll be NATO. It won't be something else, but it'll be a more European NATO. And I think that's perfectly in American interest. When it comes to this force posture review and other things, yes, there will be politics around this. And if you look at the American posture in Europe now and the bases that have been used extensively, I mean, much of this, we should bear in mind, they've not been used for the most part, fortunately, actually, for European security needs per se. They've been used for power projection beyond Europe over the last decades. And so, inevitably, things like the agreement or disagreement on use of bases and overflight for Iran plays into this equation. But really, I think, as a matter of recommendation, whether this will be done or not, I think when the administration looks at this and when they take military advice about this, it should be focused on what is it that the U.S., given its NATO commitments, needs to project power in and around Europe. Where do you want to be? Which relationships do you need for all of these functions? I mean, that's really what should be the driver. I personally think that the risk of the United States withdrawing from NATO in the worst case or other things is actually lower than often stated. Could we make alliance diplomacy pretty rough? Yeah, probably we have been and we can, but that's different. And again, there's a big reservoir in Congress of positive views about the alliance and our commitments. And I think that's a very big picture thing. It's very basic, but I think allies in Ankara will be looking for words of reassurance still on those fronts, including Article 5. So, I don't think we're beyond that, but I'm not very pessimistic about it either.
I'm happy to jump in. I mean, I think a European-led NATO isn't necessarily sort of a quiet quitting by the United States. I think the real question, and we've kind of spoken about it throughout this, is sort of how that transition occurs. Is it sort of measured, or are you creating seams in terms of capability and credibility of deterrence? And again, just to kind of pivot to the Indo-Pacific, I mean, there are real pressures that are compelling the U.S. to move to put more focus and resources and attention in that theater. I don't, again, think that means you are sort of quitting NATO. I think there is a rebalancing, again, that can be done in a sort of healthy and frankly, putting NATO on a more kind of sustainable path. Will that happen or not, obviously, is to be determined.
I mean, underlying in your question is the assumptions that if Europeans do too well, do too much, focus so much on Europe, they might kick the Americans out. And then you could look back at last year, and we could say Europeans promised 3.5%. Countries like mine promised to deliver on that, even ahead schedule. So not in 2035, but already in 2029. Did it make a difference? So I think the logic, Europeans do too much, they kick the Americans out, might be an assumption that might not reproduce in reality. So I think, coming back to the point I initially made, I think the question is, is a clarification on the US side, what is their priority? And on the European side, what is their priority? What do they want to achieve? If you look at the different tasks that the NATO Secretary General and the European leaders have, it's very different. The main task of the NATO section of Rutte is to keep the NATO house together, to make NATO survive. And that means keeping the Americans in. It's all about keeping cohesion in NATO. But the main task of a national leader, be it Keir Starmer, as long as he is in power, Friedrich Merz or Macron or Tusk or Nawrocki, is to keep their country safe. It's to assure the survival of their nations. That's a different task, because it might mean keeping NATO house together, or it might mean, if that doesn't work, to think about other formats, or to think more forcefully about a European NATO. So I think it's very helpful to have a bit of role clarity. Who has what priority in his job description? And the last point I'm going to make is just to take a step back and to look at what we are observing in the moment. As I initially said, Europeans understood between The Hague and now, it's not only about Trump, it's about a structural change in US policy. And this structural change was underway far before Trump, but now it's really implemented. I mean, since NATO's beginning, Americans complained about an unfair burden sharing, but they never really put much pressure on the Europeans. They have never really been consequential in their criticism. The big difference with Trump is that he is consequential. If you don't pay, if you don't behave in the political way we like, there will be consequences. That rarely happened before. So the question for the Europeans is, we will have a burden shifting process. We will have a more European NATO. The US is going to withdraw. The only question is how this process is going to take place. Is this going to be an ordered, constructive, cooperative one? Or is this going to be a chaotic one, where the Europeans try to suggest something, the transition roadmap that the German defense minister already proposed last year? Or is this going to be a totally disruptive, unpredictable process driven by politics rather than defense needs? And in the moment, if I look back at the last months, my impression is it's far more likely to have a chaotic process. This chaotic process can still be halfway constructive, or it can be hostile. And this is what the Europeans are worrying about. Are we going to have a chaotic but agnostic transition? Or can this be an antagonistic and hostile process where Europeans don't know what role the American ally is going to play? And if you are a responsible political leader, you have to think through all the options, even if you really, really, with all your heart, don't like it. There is a wholehearted conviction in European leaders, from what I understand, that we, of course, as the Transatlantic, are so much better off if we are all together. But the lessons that many Europeans took from last year, this is a little bit unlikely in the moment. So they have to work on a plan B, and this work is ongoing. And we all hope it can be as constructive and as together as possible.